Salami on rye, and hold the wild gobo. Did you know that cattails are good to eat? My wife asked me one evening, looking up from the book she was reading. Who says? You, Gibbons. Well, Gibbons may know something about the Roman Empire, but he doesn't know a damn thing about cattails, I responded authoritatively. They are not good to eat. That was Gibbon who knew about the Roman Empire. Gibbons is an expert on wild foods. Well, it just so happens, as I pointed out to Bun, that I too am an expert on wild foods. I was taught about them as a boy by my grandmother. Few things were more dreaded in our house during my youth than Graham's announcement, "I think I'll go out to the woods and pick us a mess of wild greens for supper. Don't that sound good?" Dad would say, because he hated to hurt Graham's feelings. My sister and I would say, because we detested Graham's wild greens. Then Dad would get us off in a corner and make some threats. He always referred to these threats as a piece of advice. "Let me give you two a piece of advice," he would say. "You eat your grandmother's greens without a word, and if she asks you how you like them, you smile and go, or else." We would try to get him to be more specific about the or else, so we could weigh the punishment against eating the greens, but he would stand pat on the vague and ominous threat. The truth was, Dad hated the greens as much as we did. He told my mother once that he would rather see the wolf crouched at the door than Gran coming through it with a mess of her wild greens. But he would never for the world let Graham think that they weren't practically his favorite food. At supper he would be solemnly munching his way through the generous portions of wild greens to which he had masochistically helped himself, when Gran would ask, "How do you like the greens, Frank?" Dad would look up and smile and go, but his eyes would be all wild and terrible. Then he would shoot my sister and me his or-else look, and we would attack our own portions, which would be about the size of postage stamps, but more than ample. "And how do you children like the greens?" Graham would ask. We would first check out our glowering father, then smile weakly and go, I vividly recall the time Dad drew among his portion of the greens a particularly noxious sprout, its presence in the mess no doubt due to Graham's failing eyesight. It was generally suspected that if a thing was vaguely green and appeared not to be moving under its own power, Graham picked it. Dad bit into the renegade sprout just after he had smiled and gone, in response to one of Graham's inquiries about the greens. When he was eating her wild greens, she could have asked him if he'd had a hard day, and he would have smiled and gone, Suddenly he stiffened in his chair, and his fork clattered to the floor. "What is it?" Mom asked, thinking he was having an attack of some kind, and I guess he was. He stomped his foot several times, shook his head, swallowed mightily, and then drained his water glass in a single gulp. Wiping his nose and eyes discreetly on his sleeve, he glanced over at Graham and offered the opinion, "Some of these greens have a powerful flavor." Graham, oblivious of the preceding activity, peered at him over her spectacles. "Don't they, though? Try 'em with a little cinnamon. They taste even better that way." I don't know about the cinnamon, but I could have tried them with Dutch cleanser and they wouldn't have tasted any worse. Graham was also a great believer in natural remedies for illness. Once when my sister was sick, or claiming to be, possibly because we were scheduled to have a mess of wild greens for supper, Graham concocted one of her folk medicines. The only ingredient that I can recall with any certainty was sap from a balsam tree in our yard. There was some yellow stuff, too, either sulfur or mustard powder, and, I believe, some water and molasses. She boiled the mixture down to concentrate it, and then took a tablespoon into my sister, the very picture of infirmity as she lay in bed. "Here, dear, take this," Graham said, pinching Trudy's cheeks to open her mouth, and pouring in the yellowish-brown substance. "It'll have you up and around in no time." Well, Gram was right about that. Old Trudy was up and around in 1 second, gasping, gagging, choking, knocking over furniture, and kicking walls. It was a miraculously quick cure and worthy of being written up in medical journals. And not only did the remedy cure childhood illnesses instantly, but it had wonderful preventive powers. In fact, neither Trudy nor I was ever sick again in all the rest of the time Gram stayed with us. When I grew up and married, I thought wild greens were behind me once and for all. Then, Bun read Stalking the Wild Asparagus by Ewell Gibbons. Soon she was insisting that we stalk not only the wild asparagus, but the wild cattail, the wild milkweed, the wild burdock, the wild pokeweed, and a dozen other wild foods. You never know when a knowledge of wild foods might come in handy, she would say ominously. It wouldn't have been so bad if we could have done our stalking in the woods and swamps, but we lived in a city. One day, as we walked along the sidewalk past a weedy, vacant lot strewn with the rusting carcasses of dead cars, Bun suddenly gasped, "Wild Gobo!" Well, I scarcely jumped more than a foot in the air, which says something for my self-control, for I fully expected some hulking menace to be charging in our direction. Where? There, Bun said, pointing to some weeds. Wild Gobo, also known as great burdock, Arctium lapa. Arctium lapa, my clavicle, I snarled. I hated stalking wild foods with Bun almost as much as I did eating them. Bun, with tears welling. "You don't like my pokeweed ragout," me smiling weakly. The problem with stalking wild foods in the city is that they always grew on somebody else's property. There were 2 modes of operation open to us. We could sneak onto the lot, dig up or hack down some of the weeds, and then flee to the car for a fast getaway. Or we could ask permission of the property owner. "Sir, I wonder if you'd mind if I hacked off a bit of your wild Gobo?" It always seemed easier to me just to sneak onto the property without permission. Through all of this, I tried to explain to Bun how to interpret the terminology used in wild food books. For example, edible does not mean good to eat. Edible means only that you won't flop over with your face in your plate when you take a bite of the stuff. Choice does not mean choice. It means only that if you feed the food to an unsuspecting dinner guest, he won't chase you out of the house trying to plunge a table fork into your back. "I don't believe it," Bun would say. "It's true," I'd reply. "Listen, if the cattail was actually good to eat, they'd sell it in supermarkets for $3 a pound. I rest my case." I must admit that my experience with wild foods has not been all bad. Wild mushrooms are a case in point. I am a fungophile of long standing and devote countless hours searching for succulent morsels of the half-dozen varieties I know how to identify. Indeed, I owe it to the humble shaggy manes for once improving the general quality of my life, if not actually preserving my sanity. Many years ago, I had a friend named Stretch who worked nights at a warehouse. Apparently the job wasn't too difficult because every night he found time to write 6 poems. After he got off work in the morning, he would rush over to my house to read me his latest creations. While I ate breakfast, he would sit down at the table with me, refusing all offers of food and drink. Then he would say, "Oh, maybe I will have a cup of coffee if it isn't too much bother." After a while, he would add, "Say, that toast looks awfully good. You mind? Thanks. Please pass the jam." And a bit later, "Were you planning on eating both those strips of bacon?" And so on. Soon I would be at the stove, frying him over easy eggs and a few hash browns if you have some handy, and maybe 3 or 4 more strips of that bacon. Now, Stretch was a fine fellow and good company, and I did not mind at all feeding him breakfast every morning. The problem was his poetry, which was of the naturalistic school and leaned heavily on an S alliteration. Sad, sorrow-sunk survivors of a sadistic society, saturated with strong, stiff stench of stifling strife, In short, it was not poetry to eat breakfast by. Every morning I would go off to work in a somber, naturalistic mood, and throughout the day would find myself saying such things to my fellow workers as, "Sarah, send Sally for 6 or so sheets of 7-cent stamps." One day, walking home from work, I spotted a nice patch of shaggy mane mushrooms growing on a lawn, and, with the stealth known only to foragers of wild food in an urban setting, quickly filled my hat with them. The next morning I cooked up the mess of mushrooms and was just sitting down to enjoy them when Stretch bounded through the door, the night's output of poems clutched in his hand. "Breakfast, Stretch?" I asked as he sat down at the table and began arranging his works for the reading. "No, nothing for me, thanks. This first poem I titled Slime. I think you'll like it. Oh, maybe I will have a cup of coffee if it's not too much bother." Then Stretch saw the dish of shaggy manes. "What's that?" "Mushrooms. Mind if I try them?" "Be my guest," I said, sliding the dish over and handing him a fork. "Hey, these are delicious," Stretch exclaimed, and continued to fork in my shaggy manes between stanzas of Slime. Upon completion of the reading, he asked, "How did you like it?" "Great," I said. "How did you like the mushrooms?" Stretch ran his finger around the dish and licked the juice off it appreciatively. "Just the best things I ever ate, that's all," he said. "What kind were they?" "Beats me," I said. "You don't know?" he said, staring at his licked finger as if it were a coral snake. "I found 'em growing in the yard and thought they looked good enough to eat," I said. Stretch looked around wildly. "But you're not supposed to do that." "Why not?" I said. "It's my yard. I can pick mushrooms in it if I want to." "No, that's not... Look, I gotta go." Since my eyes were in the middle of a blink at the time, I didn't see Stretch leave, but I noticed that the swiftness of his departure had sent the poems floating about the kitchen like autumn leaves in a brisk wind. While conjecturing to myself about Stretch's intended destination, I gathered up the poems and placed them neatly on the shelf to return to him the next time he stopped by to give me readings at breakfast. The poems gathered dust there for many months, and now I'm not sure what happened to them. I suppose they weren't such bad poems either, particularly if you're unusually fond of the S sound.